Hi there, and thanks once again for tuning into the Believable RPG channel here on Verse Online's YouTube. And we're going to talk today about cities. Cities don't appear in our world or in any other world, really, fictional or real, for no reason. Cities have to have a specific purpose. Cities are kind of like people magnets. Cities that we see around the world are phenomena that draw human beings to them. People have to have a defined reason to go to a city, and it's normally because the chances of survival, the chances of prospering are greater. Some people have slightly different motivations for going to cities. There are often things like religious pilgrimages, or a city is renowned for a particular thing, a source of knowledge. Someone like Cambridge or Oxford, that in the Middle Ages were scholastic cities and kind of still are. But for the most part, people have to be able to survive in cities, and cities have to be able to offer people a better possibility of survival. In the Industrial Revolution, for example, here in Great Britain, the first large cities that it kind of exploded really in places like the northwest of England, places like Manchester, really were kind of emerged from a kind of a collection of small villages. People were drawn because of the cotton industry, because of the climate enabled cotton to be woven there that had been shipped from the West Indies and other parts of the world, Egypt and India, and then later America, and it create the right climate was there, so the cotton mills could be built, and all of a sudden poorly paid agricultural workers were drawn from the land. The city acted like a magnet. Now, if we apply it to a fantasy world, you might be thinking of a steampunk fantasy world, or you might be thinking of something like classic high fantasy. Why does Minas Tirith exist? Why do people choose to live there rather than somewhere else? Why does Waterdeep exist? Waterdeep, I presume, is a port. Minas Tirith, there's a river that runs by it, so it could be a river port, but it's not abundantly clear what the economic activity is that draws people to live there in large numbers, particularly from a kind of like a basically kind of agricultural world. So you need to be able to answer that question. It might be that a city doesn't have a clear economic rationale. If it doesn't necessarily have to. You need to find some other reason why people are there. Is it some kind of city where the population has been forced to live there by some kind of evil priest or cult-like wizard that has removed people from the land? If people are removed from the land, who's growing the food? What's happened to agriculture? If there's no agriculture, how are people living and surviving? There are these questions you need to ask. If you've got something like a steampunk world emerging, and possibly the beginnings of a kind of a magic powered version of industrialization, then you have to ask yourself, okay, so when people come from the land to the city, and eventually they're in subsequent generations born in the city, and if they're born in the city, then they become modern sort of proletarian kinds of people. They're not agricultural any longer. What does that say about how society changes? What does that say about social class? What does that say about culture and identity? This kind of development of a new urban world that you've created. Okay, so one useful way of thinking about where a city is situated is thinking about, well, what economic activity happens there. If it's a port, which is always a great place to start adventures because it can be a place where all the peoples of the world, human and non-human, happen to mingle. If you look at any of the great port cities of the world, huge, great cultural melting pots of lots of different sorts of people. But if it's a port, it might be that it is a place where a particular country exports all its stuff, or it might be a place where lots of imports come in, and it's trade that keeps this society alive. You might find there's a city on the plains which is predominantly agricultural, where horses are bought and sold, or cattle, or whatever it is that is farmed is bought and sold. You might find that there are things like Dwarin, like the like Moria, underground cities based around mining. Again, the question of what did the dwarves eat in Moria is an interesting one. Where did they farm? Did they buy all their food in? And if so, did that make them weak and vulnerable? It's interesting. It's an interesting dynamic to inject in there. Let's imagine we created something like Moria, and you can't grow food underground. Then the lords, the dwarven lords, or the gnomes, or whatever you want to create, or orcs, goblins, would have to form alliances with other states that can provide them with food, and they are in a weakened position. But that makes for interesting politics, for drama, and for diplomacy, and for intrigue, and that sort of thing. And it might even be that the underground city fails. It fails to be able to sustain itself. How does the city grow? There was the example of Manchester previously. Manchester grew explosively, and what was created, because it grew so fast, and Victorians were initially largely indifferent about slum conditions that the poor lived in. It created, these huge slums which are owned by, are built by cotton mill owners and largely owned by them, and with a lack of fresh drinking water and open sewers. Very quickly there were outbreaks of cholera, and you got those throughout the 19th century, until there's radical social reform and people are allowed, people are housed in decent houses. What an interesting question in your city. You might have the most beautiful elven city in the trees. What's the condition of the poor? Is it if it's some kind of People's Republic of Rivendell, where there are no poor and there is no social class, which would, the fact that you have Lord Elrond would tend to suggest that's otherwise, then how is wealth, how are resources distributed? If it is the kind of the cutthroat of fantasy capitalism or fantasy feudalism, how do the poor live? And what is the remedy for poverty? Are there things that are kind of created for them for free in order to kind of alleviate the misery of the poor? Are certain character origins, we don't use the word races, but are certain character origins more likely to be poor than others? Is there discrimination in the city? Are there districts within the city for the poor? How is the city administered? How does it stop tearing itself apart? Is there law and order? And if there is law and order, what laws are in place, and what does the law protect? If you go back to the previous example of the People's Republic of Rivendell, if there's no property, if everything is shared, if we're in this sort of socialist utopia with the elves, then are we at a point where there's no such thing as theft? There's no need to enforce laws against it. Very often, for much of medieval and early modern history, laws were there, and they still obviously are, but very brutal and violent laws are in place to protect private property because of the widespread nature of inequality and poverty in society. The thing you have to do more than anything else is protect the tokens of the trinkets of the rich from the poor. But if you have a city that's so sort of futuristic, where abundance is so immense, where there is so much to go around for everybody, is there a need? Does theft happen? And if theft doesn't happen, or then is there a need for laws against it, or is it something that is criminalized if there's so much abundance? Is violence against the individual something you're more likely to encounter, or is something else, is magic or technology or information the sought after scarce thing that people will try to acquire within the city? There are these interesting dynamics. So we've talked about economics there. We've talked about how there has to be an economic rationale for the city. The city must be strategically located close to resources in order to survive. We talked about how the city acts as a magnet for human beings and for non-human creatures, because the city will offer abundance, prosperity, or the possibility of a better life. And we talked about social divisions and social class. And geographically within a city, poor people will be in one part and rich people will be in another, unless they're particularly keen to live amongst the poor, which they rarely are. And then you need to think about, is the city the kind of the hub of a wider polity? Is it the centre of a nation? Is it the centre of political power in a nation, or even an empire? And if it is, what relationship does it have to the other towns and cities within the nation or empire? And to what extent does the nation or the empire interact with the city? Does Coruscant at the centre of the Star Wars universe, that is the hub of the Galactic Republic and then the Galactic Empire, and it is a place where people come to and fro. But not all metropoles of empires are like that. Some are simply places where the imperialists leave to dominate the empire, and there's very little kind of counter traffic. So these questions are really important for when you consider what is the kind of the nature and the identity of the fantasy city you're trying to create, especially if you're trying to establish itself within kind of parameters of believability, which is basically what this YouTube is all about. Anyway, we'll be doing some more videos about fantasy believable stuff in the next few weeks, so make sure you subscribe, follow, like, comment and share and say nice things, and we'll catch you on the next Believable RPG video. Thanks very much. All the best. Bye bye.